Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, moni moli wanji, namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jadley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We're coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted that you are joining us in our mission to help families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcast. Our guest today is Janet Fox. She is here to celebrate her early middle grade novel. It's called Carry Me Home, and it encourages kids to talk about the communities we can become. Before we invite Janet into the studio, we want to let you know that this episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast is brought to you by a beautiful picture book. It's The Day the Instruments Split, a beautiful book by Trinity Bursey and illustrated by John D. Schull. When all of the instruments decide to only play with their own kind, the entire town goes haywire. Can Lyric, the piano, and her friends help everyone see that their differences create something beautiful to celebrate before it's too late? Discover the healing power of love and unity in this timely adventure. We really love this book, The Day the Instruments Split by Trinity Bursey. Joining us right now from the great state of Montana, our guest today is returning to the show. She was part of our fantastic spooky middle grade Halloween special. She's here to celebrate her latest middle grade novel. It's called Carry Me Home. Please welcome to the show, Janet Fox. Hey, Janet, how are you?
I'm great, Jed. Thank you for having me.
I'm excited to have you on, and I'm excited to speak to you about Carry Me Home. Can you tell us about the story, please?
Sure. It deals with a tough topic, but in I think, a gentle way, if you want to put it that way. This happens on page 1, so it's not going to be any surprise. A girl wakes up in the morning, 12 years old, in a car and with her sister, and her dad, who is also living in the car with them, is missing. And from that point, she has to take responsibility for herself and her sister as they are homeless and in a new community. And in fact, I set it in Montana, and I fictionalized a town near where I live, and created the community around this. And actually, community is the key to this story, because it is a story about her learning how to ask for help, and the community around her that steps up to help her and her sister. So, and it has a happy ending. I just want to say that because it's a tough topic.
It is a tough topic, but it's a topic that we absolutely have to address today. Do you have, and I know a lot of people would sit back and, they might think, oh yeah, there's homelessness, but, how many people are really homeless? Do you have any idea off the top of your head what numbers we're talking about?
That's a great question. I don't, but I do know that it's a huge problem everywhere. Even here in Montana, where we can get to 30 below zero, there are encampments of people living in tents and in cars. It just makes me so sad, and it troubles me because I know that there are kids involved in these situations. Our warming center here in Bozeman and the one in the nearby town, Livingston, where this is fictionally set, both doubled the space in their warming centers this year, to accommodate, I think they can now accommodate 50 to 100 people every night. And they're packed, and they turn people away. So that's a huge number of people who are potentially exposed. They had, I heard on the news a couple of days ago that at least 5 people froze to death last winter because they had no home, they had no place to go, and the warming center was full. So and this is a tragedy that I think is spreading across the country. partly because of the pandemic, partly because housing prices have just skyrocketed everywhere. Certainly here in Montana, it's hard to find affordable housing. And so I think this is a problem that's only going to get worse. So I tried to address this from the child's point of view. What do you do? How do you feel? How do you ask for help? Because it's really hard for kids to ask for help. And then I'm hoping that it spurs a conversation among families and in schools. How do we as a larger community, as a country, deal with this? What do we do? What's the best way to treat it?
It's very disturbing for me to think that here in the United States and other countries that, we call ourselves developed and compassionate, that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people that are homeless or living in conditions that I think most of us would say are unacceptable. There are families that are living in motel rooms, and they're the lucky ones. They're
right.
being helped. They were able to ask for help. And so they're living and it might be 4 or 5 people living in basically right. 300 square feet of space. And maybe they have a microwave. Maybe they've snuck in a hot plate. But they don't have a kitchen. They don't have any kind of privacy.
Right.
I just had a conversation over the weekend with a dear friend of mine who is he works with a lot of folks in immigrant communities, and there are people here in Boston. The cost of an apartment is so expensive that you might have 3 or 4 or more families living together in a single apartment. She told me she was aware of somebody that, there's one family living in the kitchen of an apartment. There's another family she knows that's living in the boiler room of an apartment. And this isn't acceptable. And to think too, and I know a lot of folks will sit back and they'll go, well, most people who are homeless is because of substance abuse or mental illness, and there's a lot of that, but certainly not when you're talking about kids. Kids aren't homeless because of choices that they made. Right.
And in fact, this novel was inspired by a story that I heard 5 years ago about a family to the 2 parents, 3 kids living in their car. Both parents worked 2 jobs. So they were up at 4 a.m, getting their kids ready for school, going to their 2 jobs, sending their kids off to school. And that's when I began to think, what would it be like to wake up in a car if you're 12 years old and you don't have the proper clothes, because of course you can't afford those. You don't have a great breakfast, because what are you eating out of a car? And how do you do your homework? And how do you face your classmates when you're living in these conditions that are just really basic, really primitive? And when I started writing the book, my husband said, "Oh, I remember when he was a graduate student, he had a friend who was working as a technician in a science lab who was living in his car with his family." So no, this is not an epidemic just of people who are struggling with either substance abuse or perhaps mental illness. This is an epidemic of people who can't afford the housing costs because they're so high. If they want to live in a place where they can get a job that pays reasonably, they can't afford the housing in that place. Mm-hmm. And so this is a much bigger issue than just thinking of the homeless as indigent, which they aren't. These are families, these are couples, these are people who are struggling just to survive, and they have no safety net.
Yeah. I was at a community meeting not long ago there, here in Boston, they're looking to address the homeless problem by building more units of housing.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, they're building luxury housing is what they're building. And I was at one meeting, and the developer stood up at the meeting and said, hey, we're going to have a certain percentage of homes that are going to be affordable. And someone said, well, so what's the affordable rent? And the answer was, well, for a studio apartment, that would be $2,500 a month. To which everybody that is exactly the way everybody in the room reacted and then laughed, because the idea that $2,500 a month for a studio apartment is affordable is ridiculous.
It's criminal.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that's a better word for it, criminal. And on top of that, folks who are listening have to understand that, okay, $2,500 a month, that's a lot of money. And it's certainly more than, might be 50% of what a person or a couple might make in a month. But in addition to that monthly rent, to get into the apartment, you need a security deposit. In some cases, you need to pay a fee to the agent. So you need to start with $10,000 in the bank to get an apartment. And there's not a lot of folks who have that.
No, I think that isn't the national average $400. There's as an average, people have like $400 extra in their bank account for emergencies, which, isn't going to get you into the emergency room, much less. And that's the other part of this story. Because I based it on a true story, I also wanted to base it in something that this could happen to any one of us, except maybe the, multi-billionaires. In my premise is that the one of the family members in this family has a serious illness, and without good health insurance, the costs are not completely covered, and therefore the family experiences basically bankruptcy. They had a home, they had a house, but they had to give it up because of the medical costs that they were facing. So again, this could happen to any one of us. And in a number of different circumstances, an accident on the job where things are not covered, a loss of employment, a sudden loss of employment, and an inability to find another job. It's just something that could happen anywhere at any time. But what I really want to emphasize too is that it's the compassion, kindness, the outreach of the community that Lulu and Serena find themselves in, and that's what makes the difference in their life. That they are then supported by the generosity of the people who finally discover their situation. And I think that's what we all need to keep in mind.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about that. We encourage families of all kids of all ages to continue to read together. Just because your kids can read independently doesn't mean that you cannot continue to experience the joy that you had reading with them when they were babies. You can still read aloud with your high school kids. It's a lot of fun.
Right.
Lots of folks do it. There's lots of benefits of it. And you can definitely co-read and have conversations around the dinner table or on the way to school or soccer practice. What are some of the solutions, maybe, or some of the actions that families can take after they read Carry Me Home to address the problems in their community?
So there are a couple of things that come to mind. First, I was just at a book event this past weekend, and the bookseller had arranged, this was actually in Livingston, the town in which this is fictionally set, and she had arranged to have a group of kids who were doing community service for their own reasons, and they came in to make paper cranes. Origami paper cranes are a theme in this book, based on the story of Sadako and the Thousand Paper Cranes, which is a story of a girl who had leukemia after experiencing a bombing of Hiroshima, And there is a tradition in Japan of making 1,000 paper cranes to make a wish come true. And my main character discovers this story and decides she's going to make 1,000 paper cranes to make her wish of having her home come true. And so these kids came in and they were making paper cranes and making bags that we've called blessing bags, which are small bags filled with essentials that then they were taking over to the warming center in Livingston to distribute to people who have nothing, basically. So little things like creating a group around creating these blessing bags, or something else that a warming center might need, a blanket drive or a coat drive or a sock drive, or gloves or hats or scarves. Another thing that I heard about the other day, some communities are putting aside funds to buy motels and hotels and turning them into good living, not just, a one room for a family of 5, but actually, a habitation that is then affordable for the community and maybe not even necessary for whoever's living there to pay, except in a really modest fashion. So there are things that you can do at an individual level, by asking, what does the community need? What does my local warming center need from us? And let's do this as a family. Let's help. Let's do a can drive. Let's do a coat drive. Or what can we do as a larger community? What can we encourage our public officials to do to remedy this problem, to address this problem? I think actually making people aware of it, and because we walk down the street and we kind of go, oh, I'm so embarrassed to look at this person. I feel so ashamed. Let's do something about it. Let's step forward and see what we can do as individuals and as a community.
I really like that. My wife and I were involved for many years. We ran a ministry through our church that served a homeless shelter. It was the shelter of last resort. So all the guests of this particular shelter had been disinvited from other shelters for a number of different reasons. And most of the men in this shelter did have some kind of substance or mental health issues going on. But the thing, and every year, so our ministry would serve desserts on Friday nights, and then on Christmas, our parish would get together and give the guests gifts of clothing, warm clothing and hats and whatnot. The kids at our parish school would create Christmas cards. And many of them were really beautiful, well thought out card messages. The guests at the shelter, in addition just to enjoying the desserts or appreciating the fact that now I have this a new sweatshirt, a new pair of sweatpants, what they mostly responded to was the fact that we saw them. And we, made eye contact and said hello. Right. How are you?
Right.
The cards that the kids would give the guests at Christmas brought many of the guests to tears. Yeah. And they would come back after reading them and please tell this kid thank you. It meant the world to me. So seeing, I know it's hard when you see somebody that's down in their luck. You feel bad. You don't want to make them feel bad.
Right.
But just that gift of acknowledgement and seeing that your brother or sister is there right in front of you and they're suffering. Yeah. And I think that's the first step that we need to do to acknowledge and to help them. Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah. Absolutely right. And not to assume anything about their situation and how they got there. Right. Yeah. And the bottom line is, okay, they're homeless because there was a substance abuse problem. They're homeless because they're suffering from a mental illness. They're still homeless. They're still human beings. They still are deserving of our respect, our compassion, and our love. Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. One of the things that I want to remind folks is that we did a really neat thing here through the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Is there's a shelter for young unwed mothers or expectant mothers here in Boston, and we had a book drive, and we got authors to donate dozens and dozens of books for the shelter so that they could have them when their kids arrived, that they had these books that they could read. And we also collected a number of middle grade novels so that the moms could, get into the habit of reading themselves and hopefully develop a love of reading for themselves.
Yeah. Yeah. And these are things that families can do at the family level. Have a conversation around the dinner table about this issue. Note that there are people who are in need, and what can we do about it? What do the kids suggest we do about it? And I think you touched on a number of those points. One is recognition and just a generosity of spirit, but also doing something very small can make a big difference in somebody's life.
Yeah.
Just a reaching out a hand.
Yeah. Janet, you're part of the Spooky Middle Grade Authors Group.
Yeah.
And, so you write these spooky middle grades, but
yeah,
I don't know. I think that this may be unintentionally the spookiest of your books. It could be the most frightening. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it was an interesting book for me to write because I love writing fantasy. I write, the spooky middle grade. I'm writing another fantasy at the moment. That's my fun escape. This book, it took me 5 years to figure out how to write it. After I heard that broadcast about the family in the car, I spent 5 years not writing a word on it. And it wasn't until I had this one little idea of centering it around the idea of the paper cranes, and then it just blossomed from there. And actually, it's the fastest I've ever written a book. I wrote it in a month.
Wow.
Just came, it was almost like channeling something. And it's very different from what I write. But you're right, it can be a spooky, but I also tried to put in elements of humor and joy. And Lulu loves to sing, for example, and she gets very involved in the stage production that involves singing. And she develops friendships around that, and people who sort of step forward, and they don't know of her situation, but those are the things. And she develops another friendship with a mean girl who turns out to not be so mean in the end. And have issues of her own. So, I tried to build in elements in the story that would also resonate at a just a meaningful level for a kid to read, just the fun things that kids do. So it's not entirely a terrifying tale of homelessness, but also really a story about friendship and compassion.
Yeah. Yeah. I think of, the conversations that we can have as we're reading Carry Me Home, I think are really powerful. And I think it's powerful to talk to our kids about the fact that, there are people out there who are less fortunate than us, and there are things that we can do. I think it's also important for us to talk to our kids and help them understand just how blessed many of us are. I remember we had an experience with my kids. We were at, as many years ago, my kids were middle grade themselves, middle school age. And we're going through Costco. And we loved it because we could just feast on all these samples as we went down the aisles. And at that time, we were sponsoring a student in India. And we really enjoyed writing to Joby in India, and was so proud of what he's doing. We're still in touch with him 20 years later. But as we were going through the aisles and getting these free samples of wine, of dumplings and pierogies and all these different things, we got back in the car, and I said, we just ate for free more than a lot of people in Joby's village eat in a week. Yeah. And it was kind of a slap in the head to all of us. We
Sure.
all just kind of sat there and said, wow.
Yeah.
And I think it's important. I really think it's important for us to acknowledge. I don't want us to, look back on this time in history, the pandemic, without realizing, how the different circumstances all of us kind of experience this on.
Yeah, absolutely. And the pandemic was kind of focused the lens really tight, didn't it? Because we suddenly realized we need each other. Mm-hmm. We really missed each other. Mm-hmm. We missed those interactions, the ability to, give someone a hug. And I think that, focusing on that part of it, the kind of community that we can become, is really crucial to building a better world.
I love that.
And yeah.
Think about that. The community we can become.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Well, I think that's a great place for us to end this conversation, because it's just a great starting point. Please, Janet, tell everybody where they can go to find out more about Carry Me Home and find out more about you.
Sure. I have a website, Janet S, as in Sam, Fox.com. I'm also on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram. And Carry Me Home is published by Simon & Schuster, so you can find information about the book on their website. And I love to interact. Please contact me if you have questions or suggestions. Let's do this together. I would love to see this become a movement, honestly.
Absolutely, yeah. We've had a really great time speaking about Carry Me Home and thinking about all the ways that we can come together as community. And we've been speaking with our guest, Janet Fox. Hey, Janet, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, Jed. Thank you so much.
Please be sure to join us for the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. It's another Reading with Your Kids Rewind, moments worth sharing. From the Reading with Your Kids podcast, we'll be listening back to some great moments talking about faith. And as we approach the Christmas holiday, we're talking about the Christian faith. Our guests will be Father Greg Boyle, Father James Martin, Phil Joel, and Matthew Paul Turner. It's a great show, great for the season, great ideas that we should really be thinking about, not only at Christmas, but all year long. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, I want to start by thanking our guest, Janet Fox. Please be sure to check out Carry Me Home. Also want to thank our sponsor, Trinity Bercy. The Day the Instruments Split is a really wonderful addition to any family library. Love the way that this book celebrates inclusion and diversity and just helping us all understand that we are all special. Also want to thank my team, Alejandra Doherty, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.